Schaefer, how are you today?
I'm fine, Mayor Sower. Nice to see you. We have a cold day today to be out.
Yes, it's a little on the chilly side.
Right, it's good to see you.
Well, thank you so much. You know, today they've asked me to give a few little stories about Kentucky. You know, this is the bicentennial year of Kentucky. We started in 200 years ago.
Goodness.
So I thought this was a pretty good place to start, didn't you think so?
I do believe it is.
Well, this is one of my favorite historic places. This place is the second oldest building in use in Frankfort. Of course, Liberty Hall it's probably the oldest. They started Liberty Hall in 1796. This building was built in 1797. The reason that it was built, Carolyn, is the fact that when Isaac Shelby, the first governor of Kentucky, when he came to Frankfort, he didn't have a house. He didn't have a mansion. He didn't have any place to stay. Where he actually stayed was in a little log house across from the old Capitol building on Broadway. So he asked the legislature if they would build a house for the governor. So the legislature appropriated $12,000 to buy the site, to build a building, and to also furnish the building.
A good buy, I would say.
I would think so.
Very good buy.
So the first gentleman, or first governor, I should say, that actually lived here was Governor James Garrett. But let me tell you another little story. You know, there were 33 governors that lived here.
Uh-huh.
There was one gentleman by the name of Thomas Metcalf, and he was a stonemason, and he helped lay the stone foundation on this building. And he later became the 10th governor of Kentucky.
Very interesting.
But there was another gentleman by the name of Robert P. Letcher, and he was a brick mason, and he helped lay the bricks on this beautiful home. And he later became the 16th governor of Kentucky.
So we had governors who were stonemasons and bricklayers both.
That's right.
Very interesting, very talented.
And of course they used this building from 1797 until 1914 when the new governor's mansion was erected up by our new Capitol. So the very last man that lived here was a fellow by the name of Governor McCrary, who was also a governor going into the new governor's mansion. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Right.
Yes. So actually getting back to the 33 governors that lived here until 1914, from 1914 until 1946, it became sort of run down. Really, it was neglected. And of course, during that time, they used it as storage. They also, the old Kentucky Highway Patrol, they had their offices in here for a short period of time.
Uh-huh.
Then in 1946, there was a lot of people said, "Look, let's just tear that old place down."
Oh, that would have been a
Well, yeah, some of us in the Historical Society got a little upset when we heard that rumor.
shame. I can imagine.
So Governor Willis is the man that signed in March an act to renovate the old governor's mansion. So we owe an awful lot to Governor Simeon Willis. And then along came Happy Chandler, and Happy Chandler said, I believe it was about 1956, he said, I think we ought to have a place, a home for the lieutenant governors of Kentucky.
Right.
So this has been the home of the lieutenant governors since about 1956. The first lieutenant governor to live here was my very good friend, Harry Lee Waterfield, and his lovely wife, Laura. And now, the first ones to live here in the lieutenant governor. And you know one thing? This is the oldest official executive mansion in use in the United States.
Is that right? Very impressive.
Very impressive. And now we have another lovely lady that is the wife of the lieutenant governor. And she is a real nice lady, Mrs. Patton.
And I bet we get to meet her right now.
Let's go see.
I'd love to.
Okay.
Well, hello there, Sarah.
How
Good
do
seeing you this
So nice to
afternoon.
see you, Miss Patton. And this is my cohort. She's going to help on the commentary, and her name is Carolyn Schaefer,
Carolyn,
Mrs. Patton.
so good meeting you. Please
Nice
come
to meet
in.
you. Thank you
ma'am.
very
Thank
much.
you, ma'am. Miss Patton, certainly is awful nice for you to have us here.
Well, it's a pleasure for me.
Well, thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
We're so proud of this historical home. We want
Well, we're just so happy to be here, and it's nice for you to allow us to come in and sort of take a few pictures and talk a little history, you know. And of course, there's the gentleman that was at Shelby. Well, he was the first governor. He wasn't the first one to live here. The first one to live here, of course, was James Garrett. And but we're going to talk a little bit about Isaac Shelby a little later. I thought maybe both of you, I guess Mrs. Patton already knows, that at the head of the steps is the oldest piece here in the governor's mansion, and that's an 8-day grandfather's clock, and I believe, as I understand it, it dates back to 1780.
Yes.
How about that? My goodness, I'll have it. They tell me it still keeps
It does.
pretty good time.
chimes every hour.
They-
It's
Yeah.
right on the button.
Back in the old days, why they made things, you know, by
Right, they-
hand, and everything had to be just perfect. Also, I thought another thing that I should show the people, and that is this pan over here is the original pan it's a gold pan that was used by Governor Simeon Willis. You know, in 1946, some thought about tearing this place down. So Governor Simeon Willis, he was a Republican, but he was a pretty nice fellow. You know? And that is the pen. He got the legislature to pass an act to remodel this old building in 1946, and that's the pen that he used in March of 1946 to sign the act, and that's a very valuable piece. I think it's important now that we go into the living room where we have some more very famous pieces, and then we'll sit down and we'll talk a little bit about history, Carolyn. That'd be okay?
Have a history chat. I'd like that. Sounds good.
Let's go into the other room. Carolyn, this is the living room, of course, of the old governor's mansion. Quite an historic room. And over here in the corner is the granddad's clock that's been here for many, many years. But the oldest piece I want to point out, you know, there is a piano over there in this other corner. And that corner was given to Governor Garrett, James Garrett, daughter. And that's the oldest piece, I guess, next to the clock at the head of the stairs. Of course, the clock at the head of the stairs, 1780. But Garrett came in here in 1798. You know, they started construction in 1797 at the request of the first governor, Isaac Shelby. But it wasn't completed during Shelby's term, although Shelby did get to live here when he came back in 1812. You know, Shelby.
Second term.
That's right. Shelby was governor. There, you know, there are only 4 governors that were actually elected and served 4 different terms. I mean, 2 different terms. There are 4 governors. Of course, the first one is Shelby. He served 2 terms. Garrett is the only one that served 2 consecutive terms. McCreary served 2 terms. I'm going to talk about McCreary and Garrett a little bit later. And, of course, Happy Chandler served 2 different terms.
But Garrett is the only one who succeeded himself, and they can't do that anymore, can they?
No, that's right. He's the only one. And that's a story I want to tell you when we sit down here. Let's go over here and sit down, and I'll tell you the story of Garrett.
Sounds great.
You know, the 2 pictures here are of Governor McCreary and his lovely wife. And I think this is an important tidbit in the fact that Governor McCrary was twice governor of Kentucky, and he was the last one to live here in the governor's mansion. The fact is that Governor McCrary lived here until 1914. In 1914, the new governor's mansion was built. So they moved over to the new governor's mansion. So you can say that Governor McCrary and his lovely wife were the last ones to live here as governor of Kentucky and the first ones to live in the new governor's mansion. Another little tidbit about Governor McCrary is this. He was the last one to govern from the old Capitol building and from the both capitals. He also governed from the new Capitol building because the new Capitol building, of course, was built in 1914. Carolyn, let me tell you a little bit of the story of Governor James Garrett. You know, he was the second governor of Kentucky. He followed Isaac Shelby. And he is the only governor, as I've said before, that was elected for 2 consecutive terms. And this is the way that happened. In the original 1792 Constitution, the governors and the senators were to be elected by electors. And the people, rather the lower house at first, they elected members of, the people elected members of the lower house, so to speak. So in the election of 1796, some people say, oh, that was a tainted election that they had. For this reason, the electors on the first ballot did not have a majority for any candidate. Now, the candidates were these people. There was Colonel Benjamin Logan, who was a military hero. He received 21 electoral votes. And that looked like that ought to be enough, didn't it?
Enough to do it, right.
But it wasn't enough because James Garrett received 17 votes. Then there was another fellow by the name of Thomas Todd, who later lived right here in Frankfort, and he received 14 electoral votes. So nobody got a majority. So they didn't know exactly what to do because the Constitution had no provision if you had that situation come up in the Electoral College. So they decided to have a second ballot because other states under similar circumstances had a second ballot. So Garrett had a little bit broader appeal. He was probably a little bit better known all over maybe than Logan, you know, but he had broader appeal at least because on the second ballot, Garrett came in first.
Took the lead.
He took the lead, and so the Electoral College, they said, okay, Garrett has been elected as the second governor of Kentucky. Now, Benjamin Logan, he didn't like that at all. And he contested the election by the Electoral College because he said, I got the most votes on the first ballot,
Right.
and I should be the governor. But the Secretary of State certified that James Garrett was elected governor of Kentucky. Benjamin Logan, he even went to the state Senate to see if they would override, but the state Senate would not override the vote of the electors that actually on the second ballot, James Garrett had been elected the second governor of Kentucky. Now, in 1800, the Constitution changed things a little bit. So in 1800, the Constitution provided that the people of Kentucky would elect the governor. So in this election, the very next election that came up, right away, Colonel Benjamin Logan thought, I'm going to beat
Get in there this
I'm
time.
going to beat James Garrett this time. I think the people will vote for me because I had the most vote on the first ballot. So right away, why Garrett and Thomas Todd, they also thought, well, we'll get in there too. We're going to run. There was a new man, though, who was very popular, very prominent in the legislature, and he was named Christopher Greenup, and he decided he'd run. So when they finally tallied the votes that were by the people, by a ballot, James Garrett had 8,900 and some odd votes. Christopher Greenup came in second with over 6,000 votes. And Benjamin Logan dropped down to third with about 4,000 votes. And poor old Thomas Todd, I shouldn't say poor old Thomas Todd, but Thomas Todd ran last. But actually, Thomas Todd benefited pretty good, I guess, from name recognition because Thomas Todd later became Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals here in Kentucky. He finally went to Washington, D.C., and was appointed a justice on the Supreme Court. And you might find this very interesting. He finally got friendly with one of the presidents, and he kept going over there for dinner and receptions and so forth. And don't you know that Thomas Todd married Dolly Madison's sister, Lucy? And Thomas Todd lived right here in Frankfort on the corner of Wapping and Washington Streets, you know, where the Methodist church is.
Right.
Remodeled that building right there on that.
House.
That's where Thomas Todd lived. So Dolly Madison and President Madison have often visited in that house. So actually, I think that even though Thomas Todd did get beat for governor at that time, he
did well.
He did. He certainly did. He did mighty well. I thought that the people have been asking since this is the bicentennial year. They've asked me for several times if I would maybe talk a little bit about what went on 200 years ago. And I thought that really when you reflect back on Kentucky 200 years ago, really we need to go back maybe a little bit before 1792, leading up to Kentucky's joining the Union, because, you know, before 1776, this area was part of Virginia. And at that time, it was called Fincastle County of Virginia. Then in 1776, a bill was introduced in the Virginia Assembly to change the name from Fincastle County to Kentucky County. Then in May of 1780, a bill was introduced in the Virginia Assembly to divide the large Kentucky County up into 3 counties. And the bill passed. It was signed by Thomas Jefferson, who was governor of Virginia at that time. And they divided the counties up into 3 counties, Lincoln, Fayette, and Jefferson County. All 3 counties met just below the railroad bridge right here in Frankfort.
How interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
Very, yes.
Also, I guess I must tell you that as far back as 1780, Kentucky's battle for statehood reflected many grievances, actually, by the settlers here. I guess you could say that, number one, the distance, the political distance and the actual distance between the frontier here in Kentucky and the capital of Virginia, first at Williamsburg and then at Richmond. The distance was one of their grievances that they had. But number 2, the second grievance was this. They were dissatisfied with the fact that they had many land policies. They didn't like the idea that large land companies like the Transylvania Company was allowed to buy large areas, thousands and thousands of land, prime land, at reasonable prices, whereas the settlers, they had to pay higher prices for poorer land. And of course, I guess the third discontent that they had was the fact was Virginia's alleged inability to protect the frontier from Indian attack. Of course, on the other hand, Virginia had the problem of distance, lack of supplies, lack of manpower, and also Kentucky's stubborn refusal to give any money for the expense that was involved. So
Well, when did the political process begin that led us to our statehood?
the political process actually began late in 1784 when, again, you remember I mentioned Colonel Benjamin Logan. He came from Virginia. He settled in Harrodsburg in 1776, and he became angered with the fact that we had we just didn't have any ability really to protect ourselves from marauding Indians. So he called together a convention of militia officers. The convention was held in December the 27th in 1784. It lasted for 10 days.
Oh, well, how many conventions were there prior to the Constitutional Convention?
Well, they were 10. But in this first convention that Colonel Benjamin Logan called, they did, as a matter of fact, after 10 days, they were able to resolve several questions. Number one, they did come up with a plan to protect themselves from attacks by the Indians. And number two, they drafted a petition to the Virginia Assembly asking the Virginia Assembly that they be allowed to join the Confederation as an independent state. Then after that, of course, Carolyn, we did have, as you asked me, they were 10 conventions leading up to the first Constitutional Convention. Now, the first convention by qualified voters was held on May the 23rd, 1785.
And were there many counties involved?
There certainly were many counties involved. By the fifth convention, Carolyn, there were 7 counties involved. The 3 original counties had been split up, so to speak, until there were then 7 counties. They were Bourbon, Fayette, and Jefferson, and Lincoln, and Madison, and Mercer, and Nelson. There were about 7 counties, and that was in 1797. Now, in 1789, 2 counties were added, and they were the counties of Mason County and, let's see, the other county was Woodford. 2 counties were added in 1789, so that when the first Constitutional Convention was held in 1792, there were 9 counties that were represented in Kentucky at that time.
Well, now, when the Constitution was adopted in 1792, was Franklin County represented? I hope.
Well, that's a good question. As a matter of fact, we weren't, because we were, at that time, when the Constitution was adopted in 1792, Franklin County was actually part of Shelby County, Mercer County, and Fayette County. South Frankfort was in Mercer County. Shelby County was in, West Frankfort was in Shelby County. And, of course, North Frankfort was in Fayette County. But getting back just a little bit, in the 9th convention, prior to the first Constitutional Convention, it was a most important one, Carolyn, because they worked real hard, and even though it was so important, they dispatched all of their work in about 5 days. But there was a very important question that came up that pretty well divided the delegates there, because on the question of separation from Virginia, the vote was 24 for separation and 18 delegates voted against it. Can you imagine that? Yeah.
I cannot imagine.
Yeah. I always thought that, we all wanted to get away from Virginia, but there were quite a few for separation so we could become an independent state, but there are a lot of people that didn't want to.
Well, when did we actually join the Union?
We actually joined, I guess you would say that the first Constitutional Convention was held in April of 1792. And I must tell you another little story that happened. We're talking about 200 years ago. Do you think we had any Indian raids around this area? Huh?
I bet we had some pretty near, didn't we?
We certainly did. Actually, when that same April, April of 1792 is when we've had the first Constitutional Convention. That same month, 200 years ago, this is 1992, 200 years ago, in April of 1792, almost at the same time they were having a Constitutional Convention in Danville, and that's another story. I want to tell you about that in a minute. The fact is that there were about 100 Indians that made the last important raid in the area. Actually, it occurred out near the forks of Elkhorn. The settlers didn't know anything about the Indians in the area until a volley was shot at the two Cook brothers. They were out shearing sheep. And in this volley, Hosea Cook was killed instantly. But Jesse Cook made it to his cabin and fell dead on the doorstep there. That left only the two widows and 3 small children to defend the cabin. But the courage of the women was really and truly outstanding. They really had the courage. They went out and they pulled Jesse on into the cabin and barred the door. Well, the Indians came right away and they tried to beat down the door.
Oh, no.
And they beat down the door. They didn't beat down the door. They keep beating on the door. Finally, one of the women secured a gun, but they didn't have any bullets. But you know what she did? She took a piece of lead and cut it and rounded it to fit the rifle, put some ammunition down into the rifle. Then she took dead aim between 2 logs in the building, and she took dead aim on a very large Indian and shot him dead.
Oh, my goodness.
With that, the Indians thought, well, we
better leave.
we're going to try something else. But you know what they did? They climbed up, a couple of them climbed up on the roof, and they tried to set it on fire. So one of the women went up into the loft, and the other lady handed the lady up in the loft water, pails of water. And with the pails of water, she would put out the fire as soon as the torch was put there by the Indians. But Carolyn, first thing you know, the water ran out.
Oh, no.
And you know what they did now? They had down in the kitchen a big bowl of eggs. So the lady down on the first floor, she cracked all those eggs. And she beat all those eggs up and handed them up to the lady that was still up in the loft, and she put out the fire again.
Fire with the eggs this time.
But soon the eggs gave out.
Oh, no.
So what they did then, they took the blood-soaked vest of Jesse, one of the men that were killed, and they took his blood-soaked vest and handed it up to the lady that was in the loft and put out the fire up there.
With his vest.
With his vest. Wasn't that something? She had the courage to do that. Well, the Indians, this took a lot of time, so the Indians got a little bit afraid that some of the other settlers in the neighborhood would hear all this commotion. So they decided that they would leave.
They didn't want to mess with those courageous Kentucky women.
That's right, Carolyn. They didn't want to do anything like that. They got scared. But you know what they did with the dead Indian? They took the dead Indian and they dumped him into Elkhorn Creek.
Oh.
And then they left. And I guess they went on to better fields, I guess.
I've canoed the Elkhorn Creek before, and I've never thought of it, a dead Indian in the creek. That's very interesting, though.
Yes.
We definitely have a lot of history around Franklin County.
We have a lot of history in Frankfort, and of course.
Mayor Sower, with the new Constitution now, who was allowed to vote?
Well, the new Constitution was very emphatic that all males 21 years of age and older and citizens of the state be allowed to vote. Also, you might be interested that we did, to a certain extent, copy the federal Constitution, because our Constitution provided for 3 departments: executive, legislature, and, of course, the judicial branch. You know, in the first Constitution, no provision was made for the lieutenant governor, and that was sort of unusual too. Of course, we have a lieutenant governor now, but we went about 4 years without a lieutenant governor. The Constitution provided that if anything happened to the governor, the president of the Senate would become the governor. Now, it's interesting maybe to know that in the first Constitution, and after they met over in Lexington, there was a fellow by the name of Robert Breckinridge that was elected Speaker of the House, and another gentleman by the name of Alexander Scott Bullitt was elected as the President of the Senate. 2 very fine gentlemen. But it's unusual there, I thought, in my reading up on history over the years, that 2 gentlemen from Jefferson County were elected to, you might say, 2 of the highest positions in the General Assembly.
Very
really
prominent,
yes, right.
Well, now, was slavery a question during this time?
Oh, it certainly was. Slavery certainly was a question. You know, in the, actually, Article 9 in the Constitution really created quite a furor, and it was about the slavery question, about giving constitutional protection on slavery. Now, the Presbyterians and the Baptists were very strongly opposed to slavery, and there was a gentleman by the name of Father David Rice that was really, you might say, the spokesman for the Presbyterians, and he led the fight against the slavery issue. There was a fellow by the name of Harry Ennis who later became federal judge, and Harry Ennis, along with the clergyman, were the only people that opposed the passage of the bill to give protection to slavery. Actually, the bill that passed gave constitutional protection that the legislature could not adopt any acts that had anything to do with abolishing slavery in the state. And it was a close vote. In the final vote, the act passed to give protection to slavery. The act passed 26 to 16.
Oh,
'Was close.
10 votes,
Was
really.
Also, of course, the legislature and the General Assembly and the Constitution delegates, they realized that their work would not be permanent. So they provided in the Constitution that in 1797, if the people decided that there had been some mistakes, they could call another constitutional convention to correct any blunders that may have been made in the original 1792 convention.
I see.
I think I certainly have enjoyed chatting with you here, but you know, we're due over at the old Capitol very shortly. But before I go, I want to show you the two pictures of Governor McCrary and Mrs. McCrary, and then that are in the room here. And then from here, I'd like to take you over to the state dining room because there are some very valuable pieces over there that I think you should see. Okay?
I'd love to see it.
Good.
Let's do it.
All right.
Thank you. And here we are in the dining room.
Yes, and this is quite an historic dining room, too. I think probably, in my judgment, this piece right here is the most valuable piece probably in the dining room. This is a 6-piece silver set that was given by the people of Kentucky in 1907 when Governor Beckham concluded his term. I think one thing that's important here to point out is the fact that etched into the bottom part there, the tray, is a sort of a picture of the new Capitol and the old Capitol, the date 1907, and also JCW for J.C.W. Beckham. Governor Beckham was a fine gentleman. You know, he probably is one of the youngest governors ever to serve as governor of Kentucky because he was lieutenant governor when Goebel was the governor. So when Goebel was assassinated, J.C.W. Beckham became the governor of Kentucky. He served out the term, and then, of course, he was elected for 4 years. So he actually served almost 8 years. There was another gentleman by the name of Governor Taylor, and he was a Republican, and then where's that little spoon? Here it is over here. Governor Taylor in 1899, he won the election in December of 1899. He was a Republican. There was quite a disturbance about it, and I won't go into the long. And as a result, the legislature was controlled by the Democrats. So Goebel passed what was called at that time a Goebel election law. So when the Democrats got in and met here, what they did actually, they threw out quite a number of counties where Taylor had a majority. And they said, well, Goebel is the winner. Actually, Taylor had been inaugurated and came in and served as governor until, of course, it was contested. And that's a long story. I won't go into that. But the thing I wanted to point out is that this is a sugar spoon here on the wall that was used by Governor Taylor in his short stay here.
It is beautiful.
Actually, you know, in this particular room, it was divided years ago. There used to be a sort of a partition running across there, and this was the governor's home office, so to speak. And then, of course, in later years when it was remodeled, they tore that part out. On the wall there, you can see that's a very good picture of Governor J.C.W. Beckham. By the way, he is buried up here in the Frankfort Cemetery, as are 16 other governors, Judy, of Kentucky, are buried here. We have one Vice President of the United States that's buried up there, Richard M. Johnson. But anyway, over there on that other wall is a fine picture of Governor Whitcliffe. I thought this would be interesting to you, and that is that Governor Whitcliffe was a grandfather of Governor Beckham.
Oh.
Now, he was a grandfather on J.C.W. Beckham's mother's side of the family, so to speak, okay? On the wall, over the fireplace, I want you to take particular attention to one that I've been talking about a lot of, and that is Governor James Garrett, who was the second governor of Kentucky. And as I've said before, he's the only governor that served 2 consecutive terms, okay? And that's Governor Bramlett over this fireplace. And I thought that you'd also be interested, if you just turn around a little bit, you'll see one of my old friends. And Mrs. Patton was just telling me that this is one of her portraits that she's most
Her favorite.
That's right. And of course, that's Thomas Metcalf. You remember I said out in front that Thomas Metcalf was a stonemason, and he helped lay the stone foundation on this particular building, and he later became the 10th governor of Kentucky. As a matter of fact, when he went out, when Thomas Metcalf went out, and Governor, well, I don't know whether to say Desher or Deshay, but anyway, when the next governor came in, he stayed here a little bit longer, Judy, because she said, well, I don't believe I want a stonemason in here. So he delayed several days before he moved out, and he would allow Thomas Metcalf to come in. At least that's a story that they tell me. But I also thought that you'd be interested in this particular piece here. It's what's called a break front. And this particular piece, Judy, may I say Judy or
You may, absolutely.
I said that a while ago. I sort of slipped that. I don't know what I should do about that. But I didn't want to offend you. I didn't want to act like I was too familiar. But anyway, this is a break front, and this was made by a Frankfort man. His name was Mr. Hollenhuber, and he made this particular piece for a gentleman by the name of Swigert, who was quite a prominent person here in Frankfort. I think one thing that's very unusual about this particular piece, Carolyn, do you see the mirrors down through there?
Yes.
And then there's 2 or 3 drawers that are sort of glass drawers. But just look at all that, most all that's, hand
Very
carved.
intricate work there.
Isn't that? That's a very valuable piece here in the old governor's mansion. I thought before we leave, and we have taken up an awful lot of time of Ms. Patton's, but I thought before we leave, I thought it would be nice if we just go in here and see all the pictures of all of the lieutenant governors.
I'd like that.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Right.
Let's move into the next room. Carolyn, I want to point out to you that there are about 8 lieutenant governors that have lived in this house. It won't be long until we've had 9.
We're going to have another picture up there before too long.
That's right. We're going to have a Lieutenant Governor Paul Patton's up there before too long. But I thought I'd just sort of read them off to you because I knew them all. Harry Lee Waterfield was first, and there's Wilson White, and then comes Wendell Ford, Julian Carroll. Then down there is Thelma Stovall and Martha Lane Collins and Steve Brashear. By the way, he had a lovely wife too. Jane was so nice. And of course, Brereton Jones was Lieutenant Governor. And then over here, right down there, we're going to have Paul Patton.
Very nice, very nice.
I thought also you'd be interested in knowing that, again, we're talking about our old buddy Thomas Metcalf.
His name comes up quite often.
But that this is a little, I guess you'd call it a day bed, Judy,
Yes,
maybe,
that is.
that he used to take naps on. And as I understand from Judy, I didn't know this, I've learned something today, that Judy said he would take his naps there, but he would be sort of upright sort of in a way.
Right.
But
Very
that's quite an old antique piece there. And of course over here on the, that looks like a Paul Sawyer painting,
Yes.
I would assume. There, it looks like one at least. And out in the back, Carolyn, is the beautiful garden. And you know, if we get the new history museum, why we're going to have a larger area back here, a nice garden. We're going to enlarge the garden for the lieutenant governors.
Something to look forward to.
Something to look forward to.
Right.
I want to say this. We must get on to the old Capitol, but I want to tell you how much we appreciate you letting us come in today. And
It's
you've
our
been-
honor. We
you-
just
you-
love to share the home.
Well,
It's
you've
a
been
lovely.
so nice, and you've been around with us, and you've been most gracious. And I tell the story many times. You'll sort of be in the same situation with. I've known practically every governor and the governor's wives and the lieutenant governors and their wives. And I've said many times before that Laura Waterfield was a most gracious lady. She was oh so nice. And I have a feeling, Carolyn, that this lady by the name of Judy Patton's going to run in there pretty close.
It's going to give her some competition, huh?
Thank you.
Well, I've enjoyed meeting you, and I've
Thank
enjoyed
you.
and
And do
appreciate your
come back.
hospitality.
Do come
It's
back.
been great.
I appreciate
We're
it.
proud of this home.
Thanks a lot.
I can imagine.
We're off
Thank
to
you.
the old Capitol.